Hello and welcome. You're watching WION with me, Neha Khanna, and joining me on the show tonight is my co-anchor and economic commentator, Jasper Reid. In the course of this special hour-long broadcast, we will give you a complete lowdown on India's economic survey and the big expectations from tomorrow's budget. Jasper?
Great to be here, Neha. We've got a fantastic show today. We've got an expert panel from 4 countries, from India, the UK, Switzerland and the United States. And we'll be looking at the results of today's economic survey and unpacking tomorrow's union budget. Exciting times, Neha.
Very exciting and lots to talk about. We have a packed show coming up for you. We will go across to our group of experts, as Jasper just pointed out, in a moment. But before that, let's take a look at our top story. Well, India will unveil its annual budget on Wednesday, the 1st of February. Amid a darkening global economic outlook, falling demand for exports and high inflation, the IMF, ahead of the budget announcement, has called India a bright spot, even as it projected a slowdown next year. Similarly, India's economic survey projects GDP growth to ease to a 3-year low of 6.1 to 6.8% for the next fiscal year, starting in April. That slowdown is expected to be largely driven by waning foreign demand for Indian exports, a weaker rupee and high inflation from the Russia-Ukraine war, which shows no signs of abating at the moment. In addition, domestic demand and imports are projected to remain strong, widening the trade gap, which is forecast to remain high. Despite the expected slowdown, India is still forecast to be one of the fastest growing major economies, driven by robust consumption at home. Now, what does the world expect? After Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman tabled the economic survey in Parliament today, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said the world's eyes are on India's budget amid the global uncertainty. Prime Minister Modi added, this budget will also be a bright spot for the shaky global economy, and he was confident that India's budget would live up to all expectations. Broadly, the government is likely to focus on managing its finances in a tough year for the global economy, with the threat of a recession in Western nations looming. India will need to focus on attracting foreign investors by balancing government spending to support growth, rather than populist measures ahead of the 2024 parliamentary elections. Foreign investors want the country to prioritize economic stability and present a clear path to cut deficits. Prime Minister Modi's government will also need to work on a plan to create enough jobs for over 500 million youth joining the workforce each year. Experts say India should allocate money to improve job opportunities for the rural and the urban population. Let me introduce the guests. All right, so as you mentioned at the start of the show, Jasper, lots to unpack over the next 1 hour. The economic survey and, of course, the sky-high expectations from tomorrow's budget. Let's find out what our panel of experts feel. Let's quickly introduce them. Joining us on the show today, Jayant Krishna, Chief Executive Officer, Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology and former CEO of the UK-India Business Council. Joining us from Delhi tonight, Daniel Geltrud, American business analyst and economist, joining us from New Jersey, the United States. Also with us, Sharmila, Chief Economist, Wellburn Research Services. Joining us from London and completing the panel tonight is Guido, Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special broadcast on WION. Thank you for joining us and making the time. Jayant Krishna, if I could begin with you. Going by the economic survey and IMF's projections, it does look like India is indeed a bright spot. Its economy is said to be robust and on track. What, according to you, is really going India's way? What are some of the tailwinds, you think, that are working to India's advantage in the current environment?
I think one is, our dependence on domestic consumption. India's, the entire GDP, a very sizable part of it comes from domestic consumption. And for a large population, it augurs well. Our GDP, which had, gone down to minus 6 to 7% during COVID, has recovered, and we have crossed the pre-COVID level in terms of size of our economy. I think fundamentally, I believe this is going to be the last full-blown budget of the Prime Minister Modi's government. And this is the last chance for big ticket reforms, the way I see it. That's very, very important, See, as the manufacturing supply chains are, part of it, if not fully, they're fleeing China. I think it's very, very important the government to send the signal through the budget that they mean business. And although it's difficult because, this being the last budget and after a few months, the election tempo and the fervor would kick off. So I think government has to refrain from populist measures. That's very, very important, and look at some of the fundamentals. One area, while, the IMF has painted India's economy as doing well, a bright spot and all that. But one area where we need to, pull our socks, I fundamentally believe, is the trade. If you look at our balance of trade, it is, there is a almost 290 to 300 billion dollar worth of deficit, which is the deficit is almost 9% of GDP, So I think that's one thing, our trade to GDP ratio has to improve. Some of the trade deals, I mean, with UK, for example, the free trade agreement discussions which are in progress, those have to, reach a logical end. US-India trade talks have not taken off as well as they were expected to. That's very important. And the same holds good for EU also. EU also, there was some resurgence, but again, it has gone back. So I think those trade deals are very, very, very important to my mind. And if the reforms do not happen this year, then, perhaps the two full innings of the Modi government would have, what they would have completed next year. There'll be no window left. Even if you look at the first 5 years, most of the reforms happened were in the first 3 years, be it GST, be it the bankruptcy code, be it the huge tax rate, I'm talking about the corporate tax rate rationalization that happened. So I think, all these things at this point of time, to my mind, the most important things is other than trade, which I've already described, is, we need to look at our land acquisition bill, that needs some simplification. Some of the labor laws which were consolidated into 4 categories, I think on the ground, the industry has still not got respite from the clutches of labor laws. Some labor laws are good, but many of them are outdated, outmoded. Those need to be revisited. Even the GST categorization and rate, rationalization is very much required. So I think these are the kind of things which are important. Even the the disinvestment front. I mean, the government did a fantastic job by privatizing Air India, but there are more public sectors, and even the LIC's equity was diluted, and government did make good money. So I think these kind of things have to go further. That's my belief. The signaling has to be very, very clear that there is a regulatory certainty in the way India manages its economy, and despite the fact that this being the last.
Jayant, thank you. That's a great way to get the show going. So you're looking for more reform, you're looking for FTAs, you're looking for privatisation, etc. But if we go back to the basics of the economic survey and the way the economy and the government are positioning this, I mean, frankly, it couldn't be a better statement of India's economy. But on the other hand, do you see anything that could derail all of this outside of India in the global economy? We're seeing fiscal tightening, the war goes on, as Neha says. So this is an incredibly bright picture being painted. But do you think it's going to endure over the next year and critically before the next general election?
So if you look at the GDP growth forecast in the election year, is going to is in any case lower. But yes, surely, as the U.S. economy, as some other economies in the world, UK itself, as they're going through a recession, or they will enter a recession in a few months' time from now. I think that's something that India has to be very, very conscious of, because while I talked about India's economy largely being dependent on the domestic consumption, but the fact is no economy is every economy, including that of India, is globally integrated with the entire value chain, and any slowdown elsewhere can affect that. And also the Ukraine-Russia war is something that can really throw some very, very adverse signals. So I think those cautions are there. And third caution, to my mind, the bigger caution is that India, the finance minister, should not resort to populism, because a lot of standard deduction increase and tax rate. I'm talking about not the corporate, but the individual tax rate reduction and things like that. That again would put a lot of pressure on the government's revenues, I think. So I think populist measures, if government can get away from and focus on reforms, then many of the negative things that you talked about, which we need to be cautious about, we could perhaps we'll be able to manage our economy better.
All right, very interesting points made there by Jayant Krishna, who seems to emphasize a lot on the need for the government to introduce reforms before it goes into the general election in 2024. No populism, but is that something that we can realistically expect? I guess time will tell. Before we look at the global economic outlook, I want to focus a little bit more on the India story. So if I could just get a word in from Sharmila Velan at this point. Sharmila Velan, I just want to play the devil's advocate. So I'm going to ask you this question. As per the economic survey, India is projected to grow at anywhere between 6 to 6.8%, which is actually down from the earlier estimate of 7%. And this is going to be the lowest growth rate for India in 3 years. Yes, we're doing better than most other major economies. But what about the fact that the rupee has grown significantly weaker? That is obviously hurting our imports. Inflation continues to spike. And then let's not forget that there is the all-important issue of unemployment, which remains a massive concern for a country which now has the world's largest working age population. Would you agree?
Well, Neha, you certainly are playing the devil's advocate yourself already. India's outlook is not without its warning signs. The main one being, as say, inflation is still high. Interest rates have risen by about 225 basis points since the bottom. And for me, the biggest one is the current account deficit, which is nearing 5% of GDP, which is a real worry, right? And this is at a time when, as we know, portfolio investors are diversifying away from the Indian stock market into China as China reopens and optimism grows there. So there's a question of, if we've got a large current account deficit and the budget deficit, okay, even if it comes in at 6.3% and they target 5.9 for next fiscal year, as is being suggested, that's still high, right? So those would be my concerns. But having said that, besides the points that Jayant made, that, inflation is coming down and most of the downward trend in food, inflation is being driven by food, which is important for our large rural constituency. Again, agricultural wages are growing by 7.5%. So wage growth is strong, and so is rural consumption as a whole. Interest rates have risen, but they're close to peaking, number one. Number two, real rates are still negative. And you're seeing this, as in, so like, real interest rates are so high that they're squeezing credit growth. And quite to the contrary, we've seen credit growth pick up across sectors, led by the services sector, as well as households and the property market, which is slowly moving into upswing. But, even if you strip these cyclicals aside, the underlying, which I tend to pay attention, because I look at countries very much in terms of where they are in the business cycle, and there it's about what's happening with balance sheets, right? And here I'm talking about the corporate balance sheet and the banking sector balance sheet. Now, if you look at corporate balance sheets, they're in really good health, right? If you look at return on equity for the listed sector as a proxy for the profit cycle, it ended last year at 14% on average, which is compares with 11%, which is a 7-year average. There's plenty of retained earnings. Free cash flow is also well above long-term averages. The point being here that from a balance sheet point of view, private sector is very much in a position to increase investment spending. Again, the banking sector, despite rising interest rates or withdrawal liquidity, are, from a balance sheet point of view, well positioned to increase lending. As you know, just NPLs are at a 7-year low. Capital adequacy ratios are at 14%, are well above the regulatory requirement of 11%. And again, coverage ratios is about over 70%. So from a fundamental point of view, Sure. India's in a strong position. I think, as I said, in addition to the risks I've mentioned earlier, the other one to keep an eye out on is does the private investment cycle actually take root in a sustainable way, and the private investment cycle and growth is led by investment rather than being dependent on government infrastructure spending. That, to me, will be the key.
Sharmila, that's a fascinating analysis, particularly of India Inc. Let me bring Daniel in here now, famously known as America's accountant, and very well qualified to comment on some of the corporate metrics. Daniel, how are you seeing this? Are you with Sharmila in terms of her bullishness around the performance of the corporates and all of their metrics?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of corporate strength out there, and I believe that India is really in a great position to take advantage of many things that are being presented around the world. Again, as my colleagues have mentioned, that's not without risk, and I think the largest risk that pertains to India right now is not the strength of corporations that would look to invest in India and to build in India, but rather a worldwide recession. Now, that is of real concern because what we see happening around the globe, and specifically in the United States as well, is we see interest rates rising. Now, the reason those interest rates are going up is to combat inflation. By raising the interest rates, you're taking a position where you want to basically tone down demand. I personally don't think that's the best approach, and I actually don't agree with what most countries are doing around the world. Because by bringing down demand, we push ourselves into recession. And recession brings with it, well, the slowdown of production. That is not the path that we want to take. The opposing path, which I believe is the proper way to go, is to really focus in on what is happening with the supply chains. Because if we can restore those supply chains to where they were pre-pandemic, that is an opportunity for global growth, and specifically for India. India is absolutely well positioned. And by the way, the strength of the U.S. dollar right now bodes very well for India because of the opportunities that exist for investment in India. At the same time, we also see China struggling still through COVID, continuing to shut down. This creates an opportunity for India to fill that void. So to me, great opportunities for India to really step up on the world stage as a dominant economic power.
And thank you, Daniel. And just turning to Guido, what's your verdict? Is India able to take advantage of what Daniel's describing? Are we on the crest of a wave?
I think it is able. It is doing very well on the business cycle side, as was already mentioned and documented by the other speakers. What I fear is a short-term focus, which is obvious given the incoming elections. And when governments try to boost the short-term performance, short-term meaning 1 year, 2 year, they tend to boost demand, and they set aside more long-term achievements. And I think this is a moment for India where it is important to take decisions that will affect the long term, as was already mentioned. It has a large young population. More than 50%, 50% of the population is below the age of 29. There are lots of young people, lots of teenagers. They need education. So education is key to prepare the next 10 years, the next 20 years. Also, in the comparison with China, something that always strikes me is the difference in the female labor force participation. In China, the female labor force participation is about 60%, whereas in India is going down and down and reached 19% according to the World Bank data. So this is a big disadvantage. It doesn't necessarily mean that women don't work. Probably they work in the informal sector. They do some low quality types of works. But if we really want to put the seeds of sustainable growth and competition for the future, it is important to equip women with enough education and enough access, safe access to education and to work, just to match China, potentials. Because China is older. The median age is about 38. However, they have this sort of 20% more labor force due to the more balanced labor force participation that I think the government should put a lot of effort. I know it's putting some effort. It's putting some effort in guaranteeing vocational schools, in helping
Chinese population seems to be a challenge there, Guido. Interesting points made by all our experts. And while everyone seems to think that yes, the global economy currently faces some massive challenges, I think we all seem to agree that India is positioned very well and seems to have found its sweet spot at this moment.